Hikaru Nakamura, then. We're here with our third candidate to qualify for the candidate cycle. First was Vishwanathan Anand as the challenger in the previous candidates World Championship match. And then we had Fabiano Caruana, who finished first in the Grand Prix to qualify, and now Hikaru Nakamura, who finished second in the Grand Prix to also qualify. So if it's your first time joining us, I'm Lucas Anderson. I'll handle the biography part. And then Warren's going to present 5 games tonight. Now, before we get into Nakamura, let me update you a little bit on news and where we stand with the candidate cycle. So yesterday, Peter Svidler beat Anish Giri, I think it was Monday. And then on Tuesday, Sergei Karyakin beat Pavel Yanov in their semifinal. That went to tiebreaks. And so they now face each other in the final of the Chess World Cup. Of course, they both qualify for the candidate cycle. It's the winner and the runner-up. So both of them will be in the candidates tournament in March. But I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that Karyakin's going to take this final. In their head-to-head matchup, Karyakin's +5 -2 = 20. And in the past 10 games, he's +3 = 7. So he's had Svidler's number for the last couple of years. And we'll see. Svidler's playing very well. I mean, we can't rule out somebody who beat Topalov and Giri and Wei Yi. So we can't rule Svidler out. He's had some quality wins this tournament. But head-to-head, Karyakin has stood better. So we'll keep our eyes on that. I think it's going to wrap up by this Saturday or Sunday. They're playing 4 games and then possibly tiebreaks instead of 2 as it was in all the other rounds. So this will be fun to watch. This is going on in Azerbaijan, so with the time difference, it's kind of hard to follow. So the candidates tournament, the field is almost set. We have Vishwanathan Anand, we have Svidler, we have Karyakin, we have Caruana, we have Nakamura. We also have a pretty clear idea of who's going to get in for rating. As it currently stands, Topalov is pretty much a shoo-in for rating. And if the tournament were held today, Anish Giri would also get in via rating. And it's hard to think that anybody is going to be able to unseat Giri because his September rating at 2793 is so much higher than any of the other players on that list. So it looks like Giri's going to get in. What that leaves us wondering is who the organizer's wild card is going to be. And unfortunately, we have absolutely no clue who that's going to be. In a past lecture, I told you that the principal bid came from Los Angeles and that the candidates tournament was supposedly going to be held in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. Well, since that last lecture, FIDE has put out a call for people to bid on hosting the World Championship, the World Chess Candidates Tournament, March 8th through 29th, 2016. It does not say where that's going to be held, who's bidding, etc. I contacted Aegon. Now, Aegon Marketing, if you know anything about FIDE, has a weird, murky past. They didn't respond to my email, not surprising. But you'll recall FIDE gave Aegon exclusive rights to organize and handle the marketing. Aegon was originally founded by an American named Andrew Paulson, who was living in Russia. But Paulson actually sold Aegon about a year ago to a Russian named Ilya Marinzon, and he sold it for £1. So the plot thickens with a very weird organization. What we do know is that the organizer gets to put a pick into the candidate cycle. There may not be an incentive for an American organizer to pay money to try to get Wesley So into the candidate cycle because Caruana and Nakamura are already in. There may not be an incentive for a Russian organizer to pay because Karyakin and Svidler are now in. Maybe if they wanted to get Kramnik in, that would be a possibility. So likely chess federations and likely bids could include Azerbaijan for Mamedyarov or China for Ding Liren or perhaps Wei Yi. If I had to put money on it, I would say perhaps China. Hopefully, we'll know that soon. FIDE and Aegon gave themselves a pretty short time period to weigh these bids and come up with a decision. But then again, they've had deadlines in the past to respond to bids, and we've not heard anything about like the Los Angeles committee's bids. So it's kind of unclear. I'm hoping that we'll find that out sooner rather than later. But it could be until essentially December until we find out. I'm sure the candidates themselves would like to know too. So anyway, back to Nakamura. He qualified through the Grand Prix, where he was runner-up in clear second to Fabiano Caruana, and who finished above Yakovenko. And Yakovenko is kind of sad that Nakamura was knocked out of the World Cup, because if Naka had finished in the top two in the World Cup, then Yakovenko actually would have gotten in as the third place finisher in the Grand Prix. The World Cup takes precedence over the Grand Prix. But that's out. Unless Yakovenko gets in with a wild card or like an organizer's spot, that's not going to be possible. And so Nakamura did quite well in all the different stops. Obviously, he didn't participate in Tbilisi, as all the players, missed one stop. But he did very well, including tying in the last location with Nakamura and Yakovenko. And so he's in. So let's talk about Hikaru Christopher Nakamura. Some people call him H-Bomb, particularly when he was younger. A lot of people just call him Naka. I'll probably call him Naka a couple times during the lecture, and Warren probably will too. And I chose this picture because it just typifies Nakamura. He's very expressive with his body language. So Nakamura was born in Osaka, Japan, or near Osaka, Japan, and he moved to California at age 2. His father is Japanese, and to this day, to distinguish between his father and his stepfather, he'll say, my Japanese dad. And his father's name is Suichi Nakamura, and his mother is named Carolyn Wiramantri. She is American. And so he and his older brother were born in Japan and then moved to California at a very young age. Now, how many of you knew that Hikaru Nakamura had an older brother who was a chess champion? Anybody? Well, we have to start, Warren did, not surprising. We have to start with our supporting cast, and that starts with Asuka Matthew Nakamura. Hikaru's older brother by about 2 years. Asuka was actually a kindergarten national champion. So Hikaru is 3 years old, Asuka is 5, and he wins the national championship, scholastic championship, for kindergartners. And this catches the attention of the other person we need to bring into the story, FIDE Master Sunil Wiramantri. Sunil is from Sri Lanka originally, and he made his way to the USA via Switzerland. He became a FIDE Master at the age of, I think, around 16. So he achieved quite a bit of success at a very, very early age. And he founded the National Scholastic Chess Foundation, which was an organization to promote scholastic chess, to organize tournaments, to match talent with coaching. And Asuka caught the eyes of Sunil Wiramantri. Sunil is in New York. The Nakamura family is in California, but Asuka's success at the national championship caught his attention. The Nakamura family moved to upstate New York, and actually Sunil started working with Asuka, and he married Carolyn Hikaru and Asuka's mother, and she's now Carolyn Wiramantri. They're still married today. So we need to talk about the supporting cast, because Naka, for as good as he is, when he started, it was in the shadow of his older brother and his stepfather. I should also mention that Asuka is no longer playing chess. He works for J.P. Morgan. He's in the financial industry. He and Hikaru are both pretty obsessed with the stock market, and it's hard to find a current picture of him. Couldn't really find that at a cursory glance. So Hikaru's first tournament, 1995, January 1995. The National Scholastic Chess Foundation, Sunil Wiramantri's organization, organizes a tournament in Connecticut. Asuka wins his division very handily, and you see he's rated 1841 when Hikaru starts playing chess. He is a very, very strong player when Hikaru goes from unrated to 684. And Hikaru, did fairly well, won 3 of his first 6 games. This was not his first ever tournament, it was his first rated tournament. He talks about his first tournament as him losing all of his games. But Hikaru wasn't really committed to chess at this point. He's 5, 6 years old. He sees his older brother playing. He sees his older brother winning. He sees his stepfather coaching, and he sees his stepfather playing a lot and doing quite well. But he's not really convinced. He is playing, and without much passion. And this really changes in the summer of 1995. This is January of 1995. He catches the chess bug, arguably in the summer of 1995. And in the fall of 1995, can anybody guess why? No, it was the 1995 PCA World Championship between Garry Kasparov and Vishwanathan Anand, which was hosted in New York City. And of course, this got quite a bit of coverage, and you can imagine young Hikaru was exposed to it, particularly through his stepfather. And he followed this series avidly, and he became a very big Kasparov fan. This continued for years and years and years. He talks about, from 99 to 2001, essentially watching all of Gary's games live through the internet, including in Vikensee and Linares and all these other foreign tournaments. He was following him very closely, and he idolized Kasparov. And he eventually also, growing up in New York, it'd be hard to miss, he idolized Bobby Fischer as well, and he also really enjoyed the play of Mikhail Tal. These are all attacking players, and Sunil Weeramantry is an attacking player. His mantra is never retreat. So young Hikaru was known as an aggressive, attacking player. This would characterize his style for many years. Later, he would develop a little more versatility as we get to. But before we do that, let's look at our first two games of the night. One is Nakamura versus Adu, played in 1999. And the game against GM Smirin was played in 2005, a little later. But there's a picture of Naka from around that age as well. So, as always, for the analysis of those two games, I'll turn it over to Warren.
Yeah, as you'll see today, I mean, Nakamura was absolutely relentless in these positions where he got a hint of initiative. He's brutal. So let's see our first victim of tonight. By the way, before I get started, I do want to talk about Nakamura and his chances and the candidates or against Carlsen. So I mentioned before that I think Anand is the favorite for the candidates. But Nakamura is going to be a close second there. If you look at 2700 chess and see the current ratings, he is number 2 in classical. Nakamura is. Nakamura is number 1 in rapid rating. It's like 2850 or something like that. And he's also number 2 in blitz rating, almost 2900. Carlsen is, of course, a ridiculous 2914 or something like that. So in terms of the rating systems, Nakamura by that is pretty much a clear second to Carlsen right now. So that's an interesting point. Now, of course, what Naka has going against him is his record in classical games, right? I mean, they've played, Carlsen and Nakamura have almost 30 classical games, and Nakamura has not won a single one. However, if you look at their blitz and rapid games, they're almost even. Carlsen has a slight edge, like 7 wins to 5 or something like that. So in faster time controls, Nakamura holds his own against Carlsen. And at least he's managed to win something there. One interesting point, too, is that although he hasn't won a game against Carlsen in classical games, it might not be a death sentence. So a lot of people don't realize that when Fischer played Spassky in their 72 World Championship match, Fischer also had never beaten Spassky prior to that match. Now, given that was a smaller sample size, Fischer had only played Spassky a handful of times, about 5, I think. So Nakamura has a much larger sample size against Carlsen. But nonetheless, it wouldn't be unprecedented for the world champion to face someone who's never beaten them. So, Nakamura has some interesting chances, and Nakamura's strength in blitz and rapid has got to be scary for Carlsen. He's obviously, one of the best in the world, clearly at that. So in the event of a tiebreaker, that would not be favorable for Carlsen, I think. I think it would basically be anybody's match. So, although I would not say Carlsen is intimidated by Naka, especially since he's never beaten him in a long game, he would be an opponent that would cause Carlsen some worry, I think. Anyway, so those are just my thoughts on that. So let's go ahead with the game. So of course Nakamura goes for the open Sicilian, most uncompromising way, and already his opponent plays kind of strange. He's almost inviting White to play Maraxi bind, but although this would be my preference, for example, or maybe Petrosian, Nakamura is not interested in a bind. He just wants to develop as quickly as possible. So F4. This is a very aggressive setup. Nakamura is not interested in castle and kingside here. I'll say that much. And already Nakamura just plays this uncompromising move. It is a real pawn sacrifice, actually, but it's a very risky one for black to take. How can black win a pawn here?
The knight.
Yeah, so he took the knight, but here he kind of got cold feet. So what's the move that wins a pawn for black here? Yeah, so black can play e5, which he did not choose in the game. But, after, for example, f takes, d takes, okay, queen g3, whoops, hitting the c5 pawn, bishop d6, back. Although black could take this, white has a lot of compensation after, say, bishop e2. So I guess he must have been kind of afraid of this kind of open position with the loose king side. So he decided not to go for this. Although, Stockfish thinks that black is doing okay here. Anyway, he avoids his critical continuation, but unfortunately it gives Naka a very nice position with which he can set up his attack. So first he damages black's king side, and now this f5 move. So normally this would be an anti-positional kind of idea, and black would be happy if he could get a piece on e5, but here it's hard to achieve. He no longer has a knight, and it's hard to see how the bishop can get there. So in this case, he's working on creating weaknesses in the light squares. So already black is unfortunately practically forced to play e5 because allowing f takes e6 would give him a crucial or deadly weakness on e6. So Naka shows a lot of maturity here for an 11-year-old. I mean, b3 is really logical because it just guards your light square bishop, but it's also not very intuitive since you just weaken the dark squares around your king. So it's really impressive that he had that kind of positional sense at that age. And rook he1 is another nice move. I mean, it might seem really mysterious to play that, but it merely sets up his attack that he executes later on. I mean, I'm really surprised he found this kind of move at that time. Do you know what his rating was when he was 11 here?
Yeah.
I didn't look that up,
he was
but
11. I think he was rated about 1888, 1900.
Wow. Yeah, so even though that's what his rating was, he was obviously far stronger than that. I mean, this.
He's flying up on the e5. He's got.
Yeah.
It looks like it's a fairly long center. Is he expecting what the bishop go to d5?
That's why his play is so impressive. Yeah, rook he1 is a really nice move, and you'll find out why here.
So actually, he was about USCF about 2158, 2200.
Okay. So even though that's what his USCF rating was, I mean, if you showed me this game, I would say white was at least an IM strength. He played very strong this game. So like I said, you'll see soon why I put his rook on e1. So he's keeping all his kingside pawns intact. And now he plays this nice move, queen d2. So this move threatens to invade over on the king side. So this gives black a problem. If he plays bishop f8, knight h5 makes it awkward to defend f6. So for better or worse, black has to play this awkward rook g5 move. But now knight h5 anyway. Queen b7. And now white to play. What should white do? It might not be obvious how to continue since black has plugged the king side with the rook, and white already has all the pieces in the central files.
How about h4 to push the rook out there?
H4... That might also be okay, but I think black can safely
Now white
take.
can go and get the queen.
You mean with queen h6?
Yeah. You win the pawn back.
This is true.
Because the bishop is going after f7, so black has to be careful.
Well, I think the downside of this is that black's king will be able to run to the queen side. Although I think this is also good for white. I don't think it's quite as clear as what he did. Yeah, no, this is probably good, but I think allowing black's king to get out over there, I think it gives black some play. White has a really strong move here. Very good.
On F6.
6. Yep. So if black doesn't want to lose...
Bishop takes, then the queen can pop up and grab that.
Yeah, so if black doesn't want to lose that rook, he's got to take. But now after queen d6, now the bishop's under attack and the d file is now open. So that's step 1. Unfortunately, black doesn't really have a good way to defend e5. I mean, if you play bishop g7, then f6 is more or less decisive. So unfortunately, he has to drop the bishop back, but now he loses e5. So white gains a second pawn and threatens now h4 followed by f6. Queen h8 is probably decisive as well.
You dropped 3 pawns, right? 3 to...
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So white won f6, d6, and e5. And he also has this growing initiative. But black finds interesting defense possibilities. So f6. Now queen goes into e6, so it threatens mate on f7, but rook g7. And now there's a critical point. So how can white open up the position from here? So the crucial thing you have to calculate in this position is bishop d7, because if you play g5 or e5, trying to open up the path for your f-pawn, then black plays bishop d7, and unfortunately your queen is kind of trapped. You know, you don't want to trade queens, and otherwise you'll have to attack an exchange or something. Or so it might look. So if you're going to play e5, you should have a follow-up after bishop d7. You mean e takes f6?
F6, and then takes queen, takes the rook. Oh, wait. No, yeah.
It might be possible, but I think in that case...
No, actually, I think you take the queen, you take with the rook.
So I think e5, bishop d7, so it's just a follow. So if you take this way, then I wonder if black can get away a little bit here. I'm not entirely sure this is so clear. If you take the rook, looks like black might be getting away a little bit. Yeah, I think black is doing okay here. So that way doesn't work. So how can we crash through?
How about rook to d6?
Rook d6. I think bishop d7 anyway. And now you force a trade of queens, or else white will have to attack and exchange. You ever seen those signs like think like a child? Alright, so I'll give you the first move. So he did play e5, and now bishop d7. But now he didn't play e takes f6. Play something different. What's that? D takes.
No, sorry, rook on d, takes c7, d7.
So you could play rook takes d7, but after queen takes, you're now down a full rook. Now it turns out this is good for white, because he can just play e takes f6. But you go into an endgame then. You know, if you're 11-year-old Nakamura, that's not exactly your plan. Now, he played a slightly different variation. He played queen takes f6. So in this manner, so the other way with taking on f6 with the pawn, you leave black with a dark squared bishop. But by taking with the queen, he leaves black with a light squared bishop. And it also turns out that this bishop cuts off the queen's communication on the 7th rank, which is useful because after takes, king f8. Now black loses the bishop as well. So now king takes, rook down. And not only did white get essentially material equality here, he actually has more. Now this black king is in a nasty mating net. Queen e4, and now g5. And now black is basically toast. Can't play king e5 because of rook e7. Can't play king f5 because of bishop d3. So he has to take on g5. But now rook g1. And again, there are no good squares. If king f4 or h4, then we have rook g4. Or actually, in this case, rook h7 is made. If king f4, rook g4, of course. And if If king f6, we have rook f7, then rook e7, winning the queen again. And king f5, bishop d3 still wins. So black doesn't have a lot of options. If king h6, white plays rook d6 and bishop f7, and then mates. So the black king has absolutely nowhere to run. So at this point, he just resigned.
Go back to the. So he saw that? What he like?
Yeah, I don't know if. I'm guessing he hasn't annotated this game, right? Yeah. I mean, I would guess at this point, once he saw queen takes f6, he probably figured that after the following rook e7 and takes on d7, that the black king simply can't afford to be in the middle of the board like that. I doubt he needed to calculate this. Yeah, I'm sure even at age 11, Naka had the intuition to understand that black's going to be toasted here. So, any questions about this game? All right, so that was a pretty brutal massacre. All right, now let's look at his game against Smirin. So in this one, he's a little bit older. I think he's 16 or 17, playing in Foxwoods, which is a casino in Connecticut. And this was an open tournament, so there's no, preparation for opponents or anything. Now, Smirin is a very strong, experienced grandmaster. And although Nakamura at the time was really well established, he was already the U.S. champion. So, although that... Oh, yeah. Nakamura was already a GM. But, Smirin was arguably not much weaker. He had quite an impressive resume, too. So let's see how this game goes. Nakamura was 16 or 17. Depends on when his birthday is of the year, I guess. Yeah, he was probably 16, actually, since Foxwoods usually takes place in the spring. So, do you know when his birthday is?
Yeah, I think it's December.
Okay, if it's December, yeah, he was only 16.
Foxwoods is
December 9th.
over Easter.
Yeah, it's over Easter, so he would have been 16 during this game. So, of course, he plays the Austrian, which is one of the most uncompromising ways of playing against the Turk, Pierce, however you pronounce it. And Smirin, strangely enough, plays provocatively. I mean, here, so he castles, which is kind of provocative. C5 is the recommended way in this position, which is also sharp, but it's arguably less sharp than what happens. So now, of course, Naka pushes and goes for a direct kingside attack. Knight d7 and h4. So although the soundness of this line, it might not be the most sound opening for white, it sets black big problems that he has to know exactly what he's doing. And I'll show you where he goes wrong too. So c5, this is the principled reaction, right? If you're getting attacked on the king side, you've got to open up the center. Of course, Naka bets on the race for the king, goes for the piece sacrifice. And now bishop c4. So white's lining up some dangerous threats. So white has ideas of knight g5 and queen h5 in the air. It's very dangerous. Now, basically, black only has one move, which guarantees a slightly better game. So I guess we can't fault Smirin too much for not finding it. Just to show you the move he played in the game, he played the natural knight f8, but it turns out this is not enough for equality.
This thing is under like bishop h6 to guard the g5 square.
Well, it's good that you're being creative. You kind of have to here. Yeah, among other things, white even has e6 ideas too. All kinds of nastiness. Right idea, but it doesn't quite work. Knight e5, just like f takes. Nope. Yeah, it turns out black can play e6. Not very intuitive because you think white can just take. But black's idea is knight takes e5. So black's idea is that he's going to force a trade. So now if white takes an f7, black plays knight takes. And now he's managed to trade one of white's attackers, and he's guarded his g5 square. And his bishop's also open too. So here, black probably has a slightly better chances. So this is basically the only path forward for black. It may look obvious once you see it, but yeah, it's not at all clear. You're over the board, and I doubt Smearin had ever analyzed his position. So he played knight f8, but now knight g5, attacking the rook yet again, e6. See, now you see the difference between e6 before and now, because this bishop is locked in and unable to help defend the king side from f5. So, you know, that piece being unable to defend the king really hurts black. So knight f7. Black plays this in-between move. So setting the queen doesn't give white much choice. Now again, black's hand is kind of forced. Black doesn't really want to go back to the king side, but unfortunately king e7 loses. What would white do if he played king e7?
Check.
Yeah, takes, and then unfortunately this queen hangs. Yeah, I just pointed this out because a lot of times these discoveries laterally like that are really hard to see, just because optically we're used to looking forward, not side to side. So I thought that was interesting. But king g8, now here, pointing at the h7 square. And unfortunately, the black king ends up having not enough defenders here. And now white to play, how do you finish the game off? Want any hints? So what you have to do is try to continue the attack while not letting black take f4 with check and chase your king around. But how can you guard that pawn and continue your attack?
How about queen h4? That threatens queen d8 check.
Well, queen h4 does guard f4, but it does not bring a new piece into the attack, and black can play maybe knight c6, for example.
Well, hey, rook h4.
Yeah, that's exactly what he did. So this guards f4, and it threatens the deadly rook g4. So now if black tries to finish development, then after rook g4, he's helpless. There's no way to guard the bishop, and you can't move the bishop because of mate among, there not being a safe square to begin with. Yeah. So this threat of rook g4 is just absolutely deadly. There's nothing black can do to stop it. The queen can't get to guard g4 because this light square diagonal is beautifully covered by the queen. So black is just roasted. So Nakamura absolutely just crushed a very respectable 2600 plus GM. This was a massacre. And actually, I think he did win the U.S. Championship when he was 16. So he may have won the U.S. Championship, following this tournament later that year.
I can see I can see that G4 is crushing, but I guess I can't see the continuation. I can see the bishop being taken, but I guess where's the...
Oh, you mean, for example, knight c6, rook g4? I'm really not sure.
Why do you develop? You have to stay by it. Why not try to get your king over to this?
You mean moving the king? So if you try king e8, let's see, can white... What would be the deadliest continuation here? I'm thinking it might be queen g8, actually. Oh, never mind, maybe not.
That was the one I was trying to go down. I mean, you're going to lose the bishop.
Well, I'm not sure.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Oh, I think queen g7 works. Now, the fork possible fork by black doesn't do anything because the threat of rook h8.
No, I'm saying instead of that, do king over.
King over?
Yeah.
So I think at this point, perhaps, white could exchange queens and go to a winning endgame, although that's not the Nakamura solution. I'm thinking just takes on d6 looks deadly. Now we threaten rook h8 and mate.
Now, if the pawn is there.
Okay, knight c6, rook h8 mates, right? Because bishop e8, we have queen c7. I think black is toast. I mean, for example, queen d3, take the rook.
Yeah, you don't have to. Yeah.
becomes decisive in that. Okay.
Okay. So, any other questions about this one? All right.
So we see that Nakamura was a strong player at age 10, age 11, but I don't know that he really followed what we say when we talk about child prodigies. His older brother could perhaps be considered a child prodigy, winning kindergarten national championship. Hikaru wasn't able to do that. He came to chess a little bit later, and he wasn't convinced that he really wanted to play chess. He caught the chess bug around age 6 or so, and then he was fortunate to have his older brother and his stepfather in the same household, so he had plenty of people to play and learn from. And that competition with his older brother really benefited him. And for a while, it looked like the Nakamura brothers were going to be dominant in chess for years to come. If you look at, for example, the 1997 K-12 National Championships, the 4th grade champion was Hikaru Nakamura. The 6th grade champion was Asuka Nakamura. And they both, 6 wins, no losses. They both dominated. In fact, the older brother Asuka, I think he had a record where that's still not been beaten in Scholastic grade level championships. I think he won or drew like 49 straight games, and that stands as kind of a record to this day. So Hikaru was certainly a very strong player. His brother was, for quite a while, the stronger player of the two. And they both got lots and lots of attention because not only were they both winning their division, but Asuka at this point is something like 150 points higher than the rating-wise than the second highest rated kid of his own age. So he is far and away the strongest 6th grader in the country. Now, on the one hand, this means that, he's dominant, he's winning, he's got all these trophies, that's great. But on the other hand, he's not really getting pushed. In fact, after he wins the 6th grade championship, his strongest competitor is his brother. And that's the only person who can give him a good game. Now, for the longest time, they avoided playing each other in tournaments, and this was intentional on the part of the mother and stepfather. They didn't want the young Nakamura brothers to face each other in a tournament. So instead, they played against each other at home. This is their dining room table, and you can see they had 2 chess sets. I guess one for analysis or maybe when the stepfather was there, and one for the brothers to play on. And in the background, you have Carolyn, who is a classically trained musician and who also taught English for a while. There they are playing in the dining room. And if you look at their rating, and this is something I just put together using their tournament history from the USCF website, you can see that the rating for the longest time, Asuka is obviously well ahead of Hikaru, but that gap narrows very, very quickly. And I just want to point out a couple numbers. May 1996, Hikaru 1342. May 1997, 1888. That's 540-point jump in 1 year. That is a pretty big jump by any estimation, okay? But wait, there's more. Between May 1997 and May 1998, he goes up an additional almost 350 points. We've done a lot of these lectures, and I don't know anybody whose rating has gone up this quickly. Maybe Warren could shed some insight. There may be some people like a Wonder Liang or maybe Sam Sevian or someone since then who's shown similar progress, but no one. Yeah, Karyakin comes to mind, GM before he was 13 years old. But I can't think of any American players who jumped that many rating points, almost 1,000 rating points in 2 years. Just ridiculous. And you'll notice that very quickly he passes up his brother. By February of 1998, he's passed his brother. And by May of 1998, he's passed his stepfather. Now, his stepfather reclaims that title there, you see, in December 1998. But by July 1999, it was no longer a question. Hikaru quickly became the strongest player in the household, and his rating shot up and up and up. By the time he was, I think, 15 years and 79 days, so in 2003, he gets his third and final Grand Master norm, and he becomes a Grand Master, and he beats Fischer's record to become a GM first. Now, since then, he's been passed up by several players, Jeffrey Zhang, Sam Savian, Ray Robson. So he's not the youngest American player to get the GM title. But at the time, it was a big deal, and there were a lot of parallels made between Fischer and Nakamura for lots of reasons. We'll get to a few of them. Now, Hikaru was a sports fan. If you asked him when he was in 4th grade, he would have said that he would love to play baseball or hockey or something like that. But he didn't really have time to because chess took so much of his time. So he was and remains an avid sports fan. You know, he'd listen to, they were talking about when the journalist was over at their house doing this interview in April of '98, he was listening to a Yankees game on the radio and seemed more interested in that than talking about his chess accomplishments. And you ask him today, and he talks about his avid love for hockey and soccer and baseball and football and basketball. But, you know, he wasn't able to experience that himself because he devoted so much time to chess. Now, by 1997, he finishes above his brother for the first time in a major tournament. Goes 5-0 to his brother's 4-0. His brother, you'll notice his brother actually does become a national master. He did break 2,200 for a short stint, and then he dropped back below it. But his brother pretty much stopped playing around August of 2000, November 2001. He pretty much stopped. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, he was far stronger than anybody in his own age group, so he didn't really have any competition. And the second reason probably had something to do with his younger brother coming up and surpassing him. And not just surpassing him, but surpassing him by quite a bit. Now, don't feel bad for his brother. He went to the Wharton School of Business at UPenn, got a really nice education. He's a vice president at JP Morgan and is probably wealthier than all of us put together. But he left chess by the wayside. Now, what's really interesting about this is Hikaru had an FM for a stepdad and an older brother who became a national master, and certainly he benefited from their tutelage. But you'll remember in our Caruana lecture last month, I talked about the role of coaching, how Caruana had all these coaches in New York, like Bruce Pandolfini, et cetera. And then he had moved to Spain to work with a coach. Then he later moved to Budapest to work with a different coach. And he had all these different coaches, FMs, IMs, GMs, et cetera, like 8-ish or so. Naka, 0. Not really even his stepdad. His stepdad certainly created the environment conducive to him learning, but Naka was not one of those people who worked with coaches and even studied books. Instead, he worked on the computer. He talks in 2005, he says he hasn't really looked at any chess books at all. In fact, he's kind of disparaging of chess books. He says, why would you learn from a book when you've got you've got databases and you've got an engine and you've got this, that, and the other. So he's a firm believer in the power of the computer. Now, G.M. Kavalek, who writes the introduction to the biography of Nakamura, ascribes this to a lack of trust. That Nakamura doesn't really trust a trainer to bring anything to his game that he couldn't get through his own work. Does that sound like somebody? Yes, it sounds a lot like Fischer, who thought that having a whole team of Soviets to assist Spassky and having bunches of seconds and everything was just hilarious. And you may remember, that Fischer was somewhat distrusting of his own seconds. He basically fired Bill Lombardi in the 1972 World Championship, and he called G.M. Kavalek, actually, who provided that quote there, to advise on an adjourned position. So in that sense, in terms of temperament, Nakamura is self-assured. He's a pretty confident guy. And when he was young, that used to come across as arrogance, and for a while he was considered pretty darn rude. But I think he's mellowed out a lot since then, and I'll get to some comments for that in a moment. But let me talk a little bit about his education. So he was homeschooled in high school by his mother. He did get a high school diploma. He did stop chess for a while and tried his hand at going to college. He went to Dickinson College for about 6 months. That didn't work out very well, and he instead decided to focus back on chess. He's tried his hand at poker, including trying his hand at the World Series of Poker in 2011, knocked out on day 2. So he's dabbled in other things, but he's always come back to his first love, chess, and perhaps the thing that he's always been best at. When you are master level strength at the age of 10 and you've been playing, thousands upon thousands of games, since you were 6 years old. It's kind of what you know, and it's certainly what Nakamura knows. Now, he did enter into a coaching relationship with one person who he could trust and actually respect for his chess playing prowess, and that would be none other than Garry Kasparov. So here's what happened. It's actually a story that didn't get a lot of media attention. What happened was, in the fall of 2010, Rex Sinquefield entered into secret negotiations with Hikaru Nakamura and with Garry Kasparov to pay Garry Kasparov to coach Hikaru Nakamura. In December of 2015, over dinner in New York, that agreement was finalized. Now, that agreement was not publicized until October of the following year, October 2011. But between December 2010 and October of 2011, Hikaru turned in some really good results. Like, this is a cross table from Vikensee in January of 2011. And you see that Nakamura won that tournament with a very strong performance rating over a very strong field. You know, he finished ahead of Carlsen. He finished ahead of Vishwanathan Anand. You can't really ask for anything more. And you'll notice that his ELO at 2751 is very different from his ELO now, well over 50 points higher. So he has improved since then. Now, Nakamura doesn't really ascribe that to Kasparov. You may remember that Kasparov coached Magnus Carlsen. I talked about that in the Kasparov lecture. Carlsen and Nakamura parted on amiable terms. They worked together for about a year. They had face-to-face discussions, Skype discussions, and Carlsen really credits his work with Kasparov as helping him develop his opening repertoire. And we know that, you know, Carlsen for the longest time had somewhat of a lackadaisical approach to the opening. And that really turned around with Kasparov. It was also the case that Nakamura was fairly lackadaisical with his openings. And after working with Kasparov, he became not only more robust and strong in the openings, but also more varied. He was able to play far more openings. You may remember in the mid-2000s, Nakamura playing lines like e4, queen h5, move 2, queen h5. Let's go. There's some theory on this. This looks like a fighting thing. No, he wasn't trying to scholars mate people, but he was playing queen h5 on move 2. Well, between his work with Garry Kasparov and between his work with his second and his extensive work with the computer, he developed a little more theoretical opening, a lot more theoretically based opening repertoire. And he's a very versatile player these days. He can play e4, d4, c4, b3. He can play all sorts of openings and does very well with them. And that makes it, and that's just indicative and similar to the universal style that most of the top players adopt these days. So he had really good results working with Kasparov, but then he kind of hit a bump, and you could tell that Nakamura and Kasparov were having more difficulty working together. At one point, Nakamura was talking about how Kasparov was really critical, and even when he would do well, and win tournaments and win games, how Kasparov would be very critical of the games. And he said, he never gave me any praise. It was always criticism. And, I considered that he was a very strong opening player, but I considered my middle game knowledge, to be as good or better than his. And, end game's about even. And so, my work with him, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he gives the impression that his work with Kasparov was of limited utility. Now, Kasparov posted a very extensive or witness from his perspective in New in Chess in 2011, right before they agreed to officially end their relationship. But their work together lasted about 9-10 months. And I do think that it made Nakamura disciplined. And I think it also translated into other things that Nakamura would not have done previously. Like, I think it also convinced him of the utility to accept draws and to save his energy. This is something that Kasparov was certainly a proponent of, and Naka would always play for the win. His early style, attack, but he developed as a player, and you could see an evolution where he actually started to draw. Now, what else do we know Nakamura for? We can't have a Nakamura lecture without talking about Nakamura and his experience with computers and with the internet as a whole. He plays a lot online, And if you look at the ICC leaderboards, Nakamura is the best blitz player ever to grace ICC. And you also notice that he has played 15,306 just blitz games. Now, Nakamura is most known for Bullet. He's written a book on Bullet, and it's actually pretty readable and actually pretty helpful for people who want to get better at that time control. That's not me, but Warren obviously is. Warren has actually led or been way up there on the leaderboard for Bullet on ICC. If you ever look at the leaderboard, sometimes you'll see his handle way up there. He's also known for making a fool out of computer engines. Now, he has worked a lot with computers, and he knows how to exploit their weaknesses. Now, I'm not saying that this is true today. Engines have gotten a lot better since 2007, 2008. But Naka is known for taking a computer evaluation where the computer is programmed to never accept a draw because the programmers consider its playing strength is better than that of any human, and forcing the computer to choose between invoking the 50 move rule and accepting a draw, or sacking something like a pawn. And the engine will sack a pawn, and Naka will stall for another 49 moves and get the computer to sack another pawn. And then he'll proceed to beat the crap out of the computer and checkmate it in a very embarrassing way, like with 5 bishops or 6 knights or whatever. And much to the delight of spectators. And of course, he preps these at home and then he can just do it on command. But of course, the programmers of these engines are wise to Nakamura's shenanigans and have since done a little tweaking of their code. So, and you will sometimes see Nakamura on ICC. You'll see him under Smallville, or more recently under his handle Capilano Bridge. He is very good at Fischer Random Chess 960. Very, very good. Won world championships in it, in fact. Him and Leveronian are probably the 2 best players in the world at it. And whenever he's played on chess.com, speculation that he was this mysterious GM Phoenix that was beating the crap out of people for a while. And whenever he's on ICC, this is a point Warren has made. It's so fun to just watch him, to spectate his games as he just mows through people. You know, he attracts a very big following. Whenever he's playing, there are a lot of people watching because he's just dominant. I mean, obviously there are people on ICC that can give him a run for his money. You know, he is certainly top 3 in the world at Bullet, Blitz, Rapid, and Classical. You know, he's good in all time controls. And in Blitz, and as Warren was saying earlier, and in Bullet, he may be the number 1 in the world. He is deadly. But lest you think that he is not so good at, that his playing of Bullet and that his experimentation with Fischer Random Chess and his experimentation with Bughouse and other variants, lest you think that that's eroded his ability with classical chess, let's look at games 3 and 4. This is with Kramnik in 2012 and Caruana in 2015. Both those photos are from the match itself. And again, I'll turn it over to Warren for that analysis.
So his game against Kramnik, it was at the Olympiad in a match between U.S. and Russia, actually. And it was an interesting scenario. So the U.S. was actually in the lead at the Olympiad with 2 rounds to go. And I don't know if you know much about the Olympiad history, but the U.S. doesn't win those a whole lot. And the U.S. was in a great position to do so, playing Russia. And the U.S. was outgunned, basically, because on board 1, they were okay. You know, Nakamura versus Kramnik, that's probably somewhat even. Board 2, maybe at a slight disadvantage. Russia had Sergei Karyakin, they had Grischuk playing Gadakamsky. So maybe a slight disadvantage, but Kamsky can hold his own. Then on board 3 is where U.S. started to have a big disadvantage because U.S. had Onashuk playing Sergei Karyakin. And that's a huge rating difference there, about 100 points. And on the last board, again, they had Ray Robson playing Yakovenko. Again, about a 100-point difference. So, basically, Nakamura had to win this game for the U.S. to have any chance. So Nakamura pretty much knew this going in. So let's take a look. So the game starts off as a Neo-Grunfeld, and Nakamura elects to take on d5. Now, if you look at an exchange Slav, you may think this is a kind of calm choice, but the game quickly becomes imbalanced. It's actually not as dry as you might think. So already the pawn structure has become kind of imbalanced. So white's center has been strengthened, but on the downside, white has this weakened c4 square, and his pawn structure is not so perfect on the queen side. So although we mentioned how Nakamura's work with Kasparov had improved his openings, in this game, in the opening, he was kind of outgunned here. This queen f3 maneuver is kind of odd. Already black's position starting to look nice because of the c4 square and this pawn on the c file. And unfortunately, Naka is already faced with a difficult situation. So, as we see, there's repeating moves, right? I already mentioned that Nakamura had to win this game basically for the U.S. to have any chance, right? Especially, notice he's white this game. You know, on the other boards, that means the U.S. only has white on one other board. So that would make the situation even worse, right? So here he elected for knight b1. An obviously very poor move objectively, but he had to try to win. So even though this move is incredibly ugly, he had to go for it. Now b5. I'm not a huge fan of b5 because it blocks that light squared bishop, and black didn't really need to control c4 more. You know, just a simple move like knight c4 would have been better here. But Kramnik, for whatever reason, decided on b5. And now Nakamura has to win, so I guess he figures the kingside attack is the only way to win. So he starts sending his pawns into the attack. Unfortunately, his position still isn't that great. And yeah, here Kramnik elects for an interesting exchange sacrifice. Probably was not necessary. You know, probably just something like knight b7 was probably a little bit safer. But in any event, it does give white some big problems because in return for the exchange, black will win a pawn, and white still has a weak c3 pawn, and e5 isn't that safe either, and black still has his nice c4 square. Now, you know, knight b3 was definitely white's best chance here. It protects c5 and invites black to open up the a file, but instead Nakamura had other ideas. He wanted to attack on the king side. Objectively not so sound, but as you can also see, he was a little bit low on time. Now knight h2. So this knight is going to migrate over to g4 and try to participate in the attack. And
That was the original knight on b1, right?
yeah, this was a knight that was on b1.
Gotta run.
So without any kind of hesitation or diddling around, you know, Naka is just trying to get this knight to the king side and then hopefully deliver mate, right? It's not that easy, of course, against Kramnik, but he's trying his best. And, you know, Kramnik throughout the whole time has been fine, and it's only here that he starts to slip up. So bishop g7 was, you know, really not necessary. He could have just immediately taken this pawn that Naka hung. There's really no reason for him not to take it. Of course, there's no even possibility of rook c1 because the bishop covers it anyway. But he should have just taken that pawn, but even bishop g7 is fine. Now Nakamura sends the h-pawn down, trying to either exchange a pair of pawns next to black's king, or maybe play knight g4 and h6, perhaps, right? And here Kramnik made a blunder. He played g5. And in principle, you don't want to move kings, or you don't want to move pawns around your king when you're getting attacked. And this violates that. So, white to play, how do you think you can attack here and punish this move? Which pawn are you talking about?
No, it's not. Oh,
h6 is exactly what he did. The idea is to gain access to h5 for the queen.
Oh,
Now after
knight
bishop takes...
coming in on g4.
Yeah, so now with tempo, the white queen and knight really join in the attack all at once. It spells big problems for black. So there's no way for him to keep g5. King g7, you're going to get massacred. So unfortunately, you have to lose g5. But now, white attacks the rook, and knight g4 is going to come anyway. So he exchanged queens, but it doesn't mean that the attack is over, by the way. And he's also opening up the queen side here. Remember, white's still up the exchange from when black sacked earlier. And here Naka plays pretty creatively, although he missed some simpler chances. So he got black's a pawn, and Kramnik sacks a piece, and they're both in severe time trouble. You see Naka has 13 seconds, Kramnik has 2 minutes. It may look like Naka's screwed, but he can defend that rook. And here Naka makes his life much more complicated. So he played rook a2, trying to wrap up that d2 pawn, but he should have just taken that pawn. It turns out that was pretty much just a free pawn. And this gives him 2 kingside pawns, you see, but you'll see after the move he plays, he loses both the kingside pawns. Because after this sequence, now he has no kingside pawns left. So he made his life much more difficult. But he does play a very, very nice ending here. So let's see. Kramnik does have these 3 connected passers, but Naka has his own on c6, luckily. And it's in these kind of imbalanced positions that Naka really shines. So with this rook a5 and bishop h3 maneuver, he forced black to push the pawn in order to save it. But of course now, our bishop eyes the queening square. And now it may look like black's toast because white guards the light squares, blockades those pawns, and it looks like c8 queen is forced. But now Kramnik plays e2. So now we have a problem because if we take this pawn, then f3 followed by taking c7, and the game will be drawn. So after e2, how can white play here? Exactly.
Now he has a 2-piece advantage.
So now we have this, again, really imbalanced situation where three minor pieces, 2 knights and a bishop. And it's really pretty to see how Naka wins this. And it turns out it is a win, just a very tricky one. So black has a couple pawns left. Unfortunately for Kramnik, he can't hold on to them. Now, luckily, of course, knight and bishop, we can mate with just that. So if white takes the last pawn with one of the minor pieces, that's okay. So slowly but surely, he surrounds that pawn, gets d2, right? Knight d3 chases bishop off of e1. And now he can concentrate on, well, at least blockading f4, if not winning it. Yeah, here to make Naka's life a little more difficult, Kramnik should have moved the king towards the center. That would have made life a little bit more difficult. But it's still a technical win for white. Okay. But he tried to hold on to the pawn, but unfortunately now his king is getting kind of stuck.
Why so he can take the bishop?
Yeah, king g3 threatens the bishop, right? But unfortunately the king is kind of running out of squares now. So Naka's blocking the king from exiting. So now this knight covers the h4 square, so the king can't get out. So that stops knight f2. Yeah, black's king is kind of running out of squares here. Now Naka keeps the king from escaping the corner. Well, it's looking kind of scary. Offers to sacrifice the pawn, but Naka declines. And here Kramnik just resigned because he can't stop mate, right? I mean, for example, bishop d4, or I just changed the bishop. Say bishop a7. Yeah, not very often do you see that kind of piece of balance. 3 pieces versus a piece. Incredibly rare, right? I just think that's a really cool finish. I mean, under promotion, really dramatic fashion to win that. And with that match, by the way, it turned out that Kamsky beat Grischuk, and Naka beat Kramnik, and Onishuk managed to draw Karyakin. Ray Robson lost to Yakovenko, but they won 2.5 to 1.5. Ended up winning that match. But then they collapsed the final 2 rounds against China and Poland. So they finished outside of the medals. So any questions about this one? I thought it was just really, really cool finish with that. It's just so imbalanced. You have an under promotion, beating Kramnik in style like that. That's pretty cool. Okay. So now let's take a look at a rapid game he played against Caruana in Zurich earlier this year. So this game is a bit different than the other games we've seen. So instead of the tactical attacking style that we saw, in this one he shows a positional side, and he's also very strong when he needs to be in this. So let's take a look. So it starts out as a symmetrical English. By its nature, it's a pretty slow opening. Now d3 is also kind of slow. Knight f3 is the more common idea, trying to keep the option of playing d4 in one move. So d3 is pretty much a purely slow approach. He's not going for any quick wins here. So white prepares counterplay on the queen side with a3 and b4. And here he comes up with a kind of unique idea. It's not really unprecedented, but typically white will play bishop g5 or bishop d2, followed by maybe queen c1, and maybe try to exchange dark squared bishops or keep an eye on the king side. But here he plays queen d2. And this is set up with the queen on d2 and killing dark squared bishop that Larson used to employ a lot. But it's really not something you see often white playing. Usually it's something that black will do. Black will play like queen d7 and bishop d7, kind of similar to what Caruana's doing. So, but it's a really, although it's slow, it keeps white's position intact and doesn't create any weaknesses. So we'll see how Nakamura uses this. And Caruana didn't want to allow b4, but the downside of playing a5 is that you weaken b6, actually. You might think that it weakens b5, so Naka might jump in there. But no, that's not the problem here. b5 square is kind of innocuous because black can play d5 and there's no weakness there. So it turns out that b6 square, that weakness, is the problem for black. So b3, because the white queen is on d2, you have to develop your dark squared bishop on the long diagonal. Now this just maneuvers knight over to the queen side. So on c2, it can help control d4. d3 was threatened, so moving the queen back is the most convenient way. Now knight a4, the aforementioned attack on b6. So e5. Caruana did this probably because e3, pushing the knight back, and he doesn't want to go back to c6 because then it would plug on the long diagonal. So e5 allows him to respond to e3 by going to e6. Now knight c2, kind of a tactical reply. So knight takes b3 doesn't work because the bishop takes e5. And then rook b3, and we see the point of this weakness on b6 here. So bishop c6, but knight e3. So white fights for control over this d5 square. Caruana plays what looks like a nice move here at knight e6. So now if black is allowed to, he will play d4, push back white's pieces, and with that space, it looks like he might be doing well. But Naka finds a really unique tactic, a unique idea here. In a rapid game, no less, I think it's pretty impressive. So taking on d5 would basically be what black wants, because then after knight takes d5, it's like a reverse Maroczy bind, basically. But of course, as I mentioned, if you don't do anything, black can play d4 and f5 and e4, and his position looks kind of nice. But there's a downside to black's setup, and it's the weakness of that d5 square.
So you have 3 attackers on it, 3 defenders. Is there a way to get a 4th attacker on it? Like knight c3?
Yeah, but knight c3 looks highly unintuitive because fork.
Oh, yes.
But white has a very creative tactical solution here. I think this is the kind of idea that working with computers is something you'll see. Because if you think purely intuitively, you're never going to play knight c3 because you get forked. But white has a nice reply here.
A nice reply to this right here?
Yes. This is what Caruana played.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, by the way, black doesn't really have any good answers here because white has so much firepower on d5.
Wait a minute. Okay, I see. What about knight to d?
Exactly. So white's threat is knight e7, and then you win the bishop. So it turns out that white can dominate d5 anyway. So Caruana eliminates one of the attackers on d5, but unfortunately gives white 2 bishops, and white still dominates that d5 square. So white emerges here with a stable advantage, although the position is still closed. So it's interesting to see how Naka handles this. So white does have the 2 bishops, like I said, but all the same, the position's kind of plugged. The plus for white is that he has his b4 break still.
So it's 31 minutes on his clock.
Yeah, well, Nakamura also has more time. Yeah. Maybe it's not that impressive since last time I told you about Nakamura or Caruana's trouble with rapid play. But nonetheless, he's still 2,800. Now, the black unfortunately had to open that because of the attack on a5, but the problem now is that this bishop controls the a file. So white is going to dominate that. And in fact, Caruana was so concerned that he sacked the exchange. He didn't want to let white just play rook a1, rook a6, queen a4, and attack him with no counterplay. So he does get that bishop, but Nakamura found a nice way to convert here. So, of course, rook f1 was forced because queen f2 was threatened. Defending e2, so he can play queen a1. First he chops the knight, now he can play queen a1. And now, unfortunately, black doesn't quite have enough play to keep white from crashing in on the a file.
Pawn structure is so beautiful against the dark square bishop.
Yeah, with all your pawns light squares except for that one.
Yeah.
The dark square bishop doesn't have a whole lot of attackers. At least attacking h2. But the rook will enter through g4 on the king side. So white intends queen h3, and then would attack on an h-file. Well, he was going for queen a1 ideas, but now the king steps up. And a little bit more slowly, white gets the queen and rook involved here.
And the black bishop doesn't really help much.
Yeah, the black bishop, other than defending h2, is not exactly useful. Unfortunately, black had to trade queens because if you play like queen d8, then white crashes through. But the end game here is just waiting for white. So
30 seconds on his clock.
yeah, and now he can't stop rook b7, followed by mopping up queenside pawns. So he just gave up, I think. Well, yeah, he played king f5 and then just resigned. Yeah. So I think it was a really nice positional game by Nakamura. Very pretty. That idea with playing knight c3, I mean, that was really nice. And played it in a rapid game. It's pretty impressive. So I think that's a really nice example how he's become more versatile now. He doesn't just win by checkmating his king in a King's Indian or Sicilian. So, any questions about this game or the Kramnik game? All right.
So Warren talked a little bit before analyzing game one about Nakamura's chances in the candidate cycle and in the hypothetical world championship match against Magnus Carlsen. And I have some numbers there for you. ChessGames.com, you can put in any two players, well, almost any two players, and it'll tell you their head-to-head record in classical chess. And you can see that Nakamura does very well against Fabiano Caruana. He does not so well against Peter Svidler. Svidler has an edge on Nakamura. He has a fairly good record against Karyakin. great record against Anand, pretty poor record against Topalov, and a good record against Giri. So, and he is number 2 in the world right now. And this is 2700chess.com. They have live ratings, and this is from earlier this morning. So Nakamura is in clear second place in the world right now. He's certainly come a long way since 2007, 2008, 2010, when he was fighting to get into the top 10, and now he's, consistently been in the top 5 for the past year or so. And if you look at his candidates, or his record against some of the other candidates, and presumed candidates, Topalov and Giri are not in yet, but I'm speculating. I don't know who the organizer's pick is going to be, so I didn't want to just guess that as well. But you'll note that he has a pretty good shot in the candidate cycle. Warren, has Anand favored. Anand's had a great year, so it would be hard to bet against him. But Naka certainly has his chances. If he plays Carlsen, they have his history, and Warren talked a little bit about their head-to-head record, and I have it down here for you toward the bottom. Carlsen, 11 wins, 0 losses, 18 draws. He has dominated Nakamura, and they both played up their rivalry. Naka wants to be world champion. Of course he does. Carlsen wants to stay world champion. He'd like to stay world champion for 20 years. And remember how way back when Garry Kasparov compared Karpov to Sauron from Lord of the Rings, and I said this was the first time, but it would not be the last time in chess that happened. Well, I was referring to Nakamura, referring to Carlsen as Sauron, and Carlsen actually did an AMA and asked me anything on Reddit, where people could post questions and he would post answers. And somebody asked him, "What do you think of Nakamura calling you Sauron?" And the way he replied, "Well, I might have been more insulted had Nakamura been a better chess player." The history of trash talking between these two is greater than probably any two modern current players that I can think of. Can you think of anyone, Warren, who
I really can't.
has quite the animosity between them?
He's the opposite of Anand, who
oh yeah,
always nice.
Anand's Mr. Nice Guy, very low key, and is friends with, or tries to be on good terms with everyone. Nakamura says that he's not really anybody's friend. He respects, he goes out of his way to say that he respects Carlsen, and that he respects Anand, and that he respects Kramnik in particular, because Kramnik dethroned Garry Kasparov. He talks about the respect that he has for those players, but he will flat out say that, he doesn't count any of the players as his friends, and the simple reason is because he has to compete against them. And Nakamura has a pretty healthy attitude about it all. And in his own Ask Me Anything experience on Reddit, somebody asked him about, how he feels about his future prospects against Carlsen, and this quote in the bottom left really speaks to that. Warren made that parallel between Fischer, who had never beaten Spassky, and went into the World Championship in 1972-1973 and won in convincing fashion, and said that, the same could be true for Nakamura, and Nakamura believes that. That's the important thing. Nakamura has a very healthy attitude. Incidentally, I'd also like to give Nakamura props, because in that Ask Me Anything on Reddit, he came across as very grateful, very humble. He answered almost every question that was posted. Probably took him many hours to do that. He seemed to be a very approachable guy, and there's stories about when he won his first U.S. championship, how he went out after he won and after he's crowned champion, he went out to the lobby and he'd take on anybody who wanted to play him in 1 minute. And he just played dozens and dozens of games against all takers. So Nakamura is one of the more accessible GMs and super GMs, and his image has come a long way from maybe that petulant teenager that Walter Brown discusses in the early 2000s. So Nakamura certainly feels that he has the ability to do this. And by the way, an interesting example of the continuation of their rivalry can be found in the Sinquefield Cup in 2015. They played in round 6 or 8 or something toward the end of the tournament, and they had a brutally long game. It went to like 95 moves, and Nakamura was able to salvage a draw. It looked on many occasions, even in the computer evaluation, that Carlsen was winning. And Carlsen made a few inaccuracies, and Nakamura was able to hang in. And it ended in Carlsen having king and bishop versus king. They actually played it all the way out to that point. And then obviously it's a draw, insufficient mating material. So after 95, 96 moves, it was ruled a draw. I'd also like to give props to Alejandro Ramirez, who did a great job commentating Sinquefield 2015 and also annotating a lot of the games. And actually this game was annotated by Alejandro Ramirez with input from Gary Kasparov, who stopped by the table and offered his opinions and thought Carlsen was obviously better and should convert it into a win, but it didn't quite happen. Nakamura showed tenacious defense and resilience in the face of his nemesis. Now, Carlsen has proved that he's not infallible. This year, he didn't win the championship in Norway. His tournament results, he didn't win Sinquefield. His tournament results have not been spectacular. Obviously, he's still the highest rated player in the world, and most people would place him agree that he's the strongest player in the world, but he hasn't shown that same level of dominance that perhaps he's had in previous years. So in this image, which comes from actually that game, when I named this, when I was saving it for later, I called it shark circling because, there's all this pressure on Naka. You see Carlsen standing there and you see all these other spectators looking on at his position and fearing the worst for Naka, but he was able to hold on to a draw. So good for him. Of course, that doesn't stop Carlsen from trash talking, saying that he doesn't consider, Naka to be the second, the third best, even the third best player in the world. And Naka responds, I think, in a very healthy fashion, just saying, I just don't care. He can think what he wants. Don't care. So Naka has had his ups and downs this year. He's not been necessarily dominant. I don't think he's won outright first in any tournaments this year, but he's been in contention in pretty much all of them, finishing in the top 5 in pretty much every tournament and event that including the Grand Prix cycle that he's participated in. So he's certainly been consistent. And there have been flashes of just brilliance. There have been times where he's just played beautifully and where he has sent tremors perhaps through the chess world at large. And I think the best game to illustrate that comes actually from Sinquefield between Nakamura seated at the table and Wesley So, who's standing in the foreground. Unfortunately, So was on the receiving end of a beautiful game. And it was played in one of my favorite defenses and one of Naka's favorite defenses. It was played in the King's Indian defense. Naka's known for being very, very dangerous in the King's Indian defense. And I don't know if Warren might agree, but I think he's perhaps the best player or the best King's Indian defense player playing currently. He's certainly very, very strong at it. And he's used the engine to try to improve and find ways of the strongest continuations for the King's Indian. And he really feels that the computers, the engines, don't fully appreciate the power of Black's attack in the King's Indian, and thinks therefore it might be underrated, but he feels that it's fundamentally very strong. And so for our last game of the night, we'll look at So versus Nakamura, our first game of the night where Nakamura is playing the black pieces, and this was very recently played in St. Louis. And again, I'll turn it over to Warren for that.
Yeah, he has a lot of nice games in the King's Indian. He's beat Anand and Kramnik and Aronian, among a lot of other players, and really beautiful games. This is only one of them, really. You can look up all of those games if you'd like as well. I would recommend that too. He's very good at this opening. Honestly, that's if I was playing Nakamura, I'd be kind of hesitant to play Queen's Pawn opening. I might prefer to face a Night Orc or something as opposed to a King's Indian.
His record with the Night Orc is quite strong too, though.
Yeah, that's true.
His record against as white against the Night Orc and against the Dragon and against King's Indian is very, very good. So I don't know what you play.
Yeah, not a whole lot. Yeah, and coincidentally, I haven't mentioned it yet, but I did play him in a tournament at the Houston Open a while ago, and I played the English against him, trying to not play D4 or E4, and that opening turned out well for me. But of course, in the end, the strong player won. But anyway, let's take a look at this one. So we have a classical King's Indian. So I know I've mentioned that King's Indian for sure in other lectures, but I don't know if we've actually covered a a pure classical King's Indian game before in any of these lectures. Maybe one of the first ones. But the structure and themes in the King's Indian come up so often, many different openings. I mean, you can have transpositions from the Ruy Lopez, the King's Indian-like positions, or the modern defense, or the Pierce or Perk defense. There's lots of possible ideas. I mean, even if you look at some of Naka's games against computers, you'll see him play the hippopotamus defense, which is like, H6, A6, B6, G6, double fianchetto, D6, E6, knights on E7 and D7. And you'll see those games often turn into a King's Indian, because white will play C4, D4, and E4 and play D5. And then I'll play E5, and suddenly you have a King's Indian kind of pawn structure. So it's really interesting, the ideas that he can use from King's Indian in those positions too. So even if you don't play the King's Indian yourself, it's definitely worth understanding the ideas in this opening, because they come up everywhere, whether you're playing on the black side or on the defending side. And it's very good to know how to play these positions. So went for knight e1, which is the most popular and probably the most standard. I guess he didn't want to venture for the bayonet with b4 after Nakamura massacred Anand a while back. So he went for knight e1. And if you look at So's games, knight e1 is basically his preferred move here. So So ventures for this bishop b3 f2 idea. It's really the most uncompromising way of playing against the King's Indian. It was Korchnoy's preference as well. The downside of putting your bishop on f2 is actually that it's kind of vulnerable to attack. Maybe kind of counterintuitive, having a piece next to your king not being helpful. But as you'll see, it's not so well placed. The safer way of playing, by the way, is instead putting the knight on d3. And not only is the bishop not vulnerable to attack on f2, but the knight can drop back to f2 to try to stop a g4 advance as well. And this knight d3 f2 idea is Aronian's preference. But anyway, he went for bishop e3. And here So actually played a little bit different. Before So has played this g4 idea, which it may look counterintuitive to advance a pawn on the king side in the King's Indian. White's trying to plug the king side up with this, right? Stop black by force from playing g4 himself. So that's another idea, but So this game didn't venture for that. So white does achieve this c5 break early on, but black is also quickly staging his kingside attack with the cloud of pieces gathering around the white king. Rook f7 is a thematic idea in the King's Indian to guard the 7th rank, specifically that c7 square. It's important to guard. And also f8 is a square that could be useful for either the black bishop or maybe the queen. So it's a very useful move in King's Indian positions. So king h1 gives the dark-squared bishop this g1 square. So if it's attacked by a g4, g3 advance, we'll have somewhere to run. So now white opens up the c file, and immediately he's hinting at maybe knight takes a7. So Naka plays a6, forcing the knight back. And here was, interestingly enough, probably the decisive mistake, I would say, to be honest. Even though the computer doesn't agree with me, its valuation goes down pretty consistently after this.
Is that also, by the way, why that knight, like the rook on f7 is there, so that the knight can't go to c7?
Exactly. So I mentioned earlier about the c7 square. So the rook isn't just there to guard the pawn, it guards that square. Because a common theme for white is if the rook wasn't on f7, for example, assume black played some stupid move like rook f8, white would play knight c7, and then, white can win the exchange in this case. But otherwise, knight e6 is the idea, basically. White would like to exchange that light-squared bishop because the light-squared bishop is really key for that attack on the king side. So this is the general idea for white, is to block that light-squared bishop from participating on the king side attack. So that's another reason why the rook on f7 is so important. So played knight a3, and he was really being way too optimistic here. Basically, the idea of this move is to play knight c4, and then, how I mentioned earlier about the light-squared bishop, play knight b6 to win that bishop. And if white could achieve that, he'd have a strategically Just excellent position. But of course, Nakamura is not going to allow that, so he played b5. And now it's clear that this knight in a3 is just misplaced. Instead, he should have done knight c3. One, because now b5 doesn't relegate it to the side of the board, and he could break up black's queenside with a4. But also because if black doesn't play b5, he can play knight a4 and aim for b6 that way. So knight c3 was definitely the best move here. I mean, knight a3, now the knight is just clearly misplaced. Now white could play knight c2 and get a knight to b4 and then c6, but it's too slow, and a knight on c6 doesn't attack anything. It doesn't help attack this d6 pawn or that bishop on c8. So unfortunately, even if white activates that knight, it's going to be ineffective. So he went for rook c6, trying to target d6, but it's just too slow. g4, getting on with the attack. Queen f8. So this guards d6 and prepares to get the bishop off the c file. Because after rook c1, white's actually threatening it to take the bishop now. So bishop d7. And now bishop h6 with the idea of perhaps g3. Right? Opening up lines on the king side as well as that bishop's diagonal. So white goes back. Now white can respond to g3 with h3. But h4. So now black's intending to play h3 and really wreck that king side. So unfortunately white doesn't have much choice. But now Naka continues to open the position even further. f3. So not taking either pawn, but opening up that bishop's diagonal. Now g takes f. And now black to play. What do we do from here? He just sacked 2 pawns, but what do we do?
Take the knight on g4.
Knight takes g4, I think, does work. But he decided to take on e4, actually. I think the reason he did that was that it leaves the bishop still attacks g4, whereas if you play knight takes g4, the bishop doesn't attack anything. So I think knight takes e4 is slightly more accurate. And now rook d1. Now, if you'll see the idea later, yeah, if f takes, simply rook f1. The rook is immune because of checkmate, so king g2. And now black has this deadly move, bishop e3. And the threat of rook g1 check is crushing, but if white takes, then h3 quickly leads to mate. So unfortunately, the knight is taboo. And really already, it's hard to suggest anything. I mean, the engine at first thinks white may be able to survive, but if you go down each path, it quickly gets bad really quickly. So he went for rook d1. Like I said, it's hard to suggest anything else. Again, this sad knight in a3 is just the bane of white's existence here. Now rook f3. Of course, taking the rook would just be disaster, right? Not even going to consider that. And now rook f1 again, like we said. Now, even though black doesn't have the high-squared bishop, turns out his attack is still plenty strong enough. King up and bishop e3. Okay. Like I said before, bishop f1 is also bad. So bishop g3, trying to get the rook into the defense, but here it doesn't work either. Black simply takes another white defender. Now queen h6. Now white doesn't have a lot of choice because, among other things, black might be threatening g2, and if you take the pawn, then how should black play here? Knight f3, does that work? I'm not sure if that works because white... Yeah. You have the right idea though. First you got to interpose knight g5. Now you can do knight f3, or you can be cute and play knight g2. And then you can mate on h3, right? So unfortunately, white doesn't have a lot of choice here. He's got to give another square for his king, but it doesn't really help him too much. So now black to play. What do you do here? To be fair, I think there are multiple roads to roam here.
How about knight G2?
I think knight G2 is a clear win as well, because you're threatening queen H3 checkmate, right? Yeah. In the game he chose knight F3, which it's just a different path. I think both are equally good. Again, the threat of queen H3 mate kind of forces white somehow to defend. I don't see any other way to defend the H3 square. So knight F2, and now queen H4, forcing the white king, just inviting him to come in. And now he finishes off with a pretty nice couple of moves. It's mate in, I think, 3 at this point. Oh, very nice. And after takes, knight E4, and then mate.
King in opposition.
Very pretty finish. That's beautiful. I mean, as a King's Indian player, or any chess player, really, this is pretty dreamlike, right? This is what you play for.
It's just such an overwhelming attack. Let one bad move of the knight and the whole thing collapse.
Yeah.
There's nothing he could do with it.
It's still there too.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, the King's Indian is definitely an opening where computers don't really evaluate correctly, as Lucas mentioned earlier. I mean, if we go back to knight A3, briefly just looking at Stockfish, you'll see that he thinks white's doing okay. But every line you analyze after knight A3, you go down a little further, and it consistently, the evaluation goes down. So let's go back a little bit. So knight A3, B5. And now let's look at the computer here. So see, it even says, plus 0.7. So it thinks white's doing fine. But if you go on any of these lines, the evaluation just quickly goes down. So they have some work to do. The computers don't really seem to evaluate these positions very well. Any questions about this game in particular? But yeah, Nakamura has a bunch of fun King's Indian games. Like I said, that Anand game where he massacred him in the bayonet, and he also beat Kramnik in a nice one. He beat Aroni in a nice one too. He's got some really nice King's Indian games.
He also, if you ask Nakamura for his favorite games that he plays, he cites 2 King's Indian games that he played against Belyovsky and Gelfand as among his top 10 also.
Mm-hmm. So those would be good too. Gelfand and Belyovsky. All right.
So a little bit more, and then we'll take any questions you might have. So what else is Naka known for? What else is he up to these days? Well, if you've ever seen Nakamura play, as in the picture here, you always notice that that he has a can of Red Bull with him. For Carlson, it's orange juice, For Naka, it's Red Bull. And so because, he consumes a lot of Red Bull himself, and because as any of us who have been to chess tournaments know, there's a lot of Red Bull consumed at chess tournaments. Red Bull decided to make him a featured athlete. So they gave him a sponsorship deal and did some photo shoots. And there you have, Red Bull has like a group of models that do this, that, and the other. And you have a chess player photographed with them. You have a chessboard in the background there, and you have this, neat little photo shoot surrounded by, I guess, glaciers or something. And, like in an ice cave. And he's the troll, the ice troll, I guess. So you have, so he's gotten a nice endorsement deal for this. And this is an important step for chess. I mentioned in the Caruana lecture that I'm actually encouraged by the fact that there are federations willing to cough up some money, in this case the USCF and Rex Sinquefield, to try to attract top talent. And and Karyakin, affiliation with Russia. It's kind of interesting when he's playing Elyanov in the semifinals. They're both Ukrainian, but one of them has a Ukrainian flag and the other has a Russian flag because Karyakin switched federations because of incentives to do so. So did also and Nakamura also. So we have Caruana as well. So we have several players who have switched affiliations, and I actually think this is kind of promising because it means that there's more money flowing into chess. And a Red Bull sponsorship deal, I think, is the same thing. I think it's great that we have sponsorship and we have people labeled as athletes for chess. I've recently read studies about, chess players burning 3,500, 4,000 calories a day during tournament matches because of, all the blood flow to their brain and their heart rate. And it's interesting to think of the effort that goes into this and how there's some sort of recognition that these players deserve some compensation and they deserve some sponsorship deals. That said, Nakamura does talk about the fact that, in Azerbaijan, Mamedyarov is a celebrity. And in Russia, several of the chess players are celebrities. And in India, Vishwanathan Anand is a celebrity. But in the United States, Nakamura is Nakamura. Nobody really recognizes him in airports. And he does bemoan the fact that professional chess is not in this as respected and admired in the USA as it is in some other countries. And he has a point, and hopefully, we're seeing some sea change with Caruana and with Nakamura and with Wesley So, and with this upcoming Olympiad. Perhaps we'll see a resurgence in chess interest, unlike any we've seen since, the early 70s when Fischer was at his peak. That's what I hope to see. In the meantime, what else is Nakamura up to? Well, he continues working with Chris Littlejohn, his second. It's really an interesting relationship because when they started working together, Chris Littlejohn's playing strength was about 1,800. And it's odd for a grandmaster of Nakamura's strength to partner up with someone else who is not a grandmaster, much less someone who's, not even an expert or a national master. But Littlejohn's expertise is really in tweaking computer engines. And they've had a fruitful partnership. In fact, Nakamura has equated his work with Littlejohn to his work with Kasparov. He thinks that his work with Littlejohn has been just as fruitful in discovering opening novelties and refining his opening technique. Nowadays, actually, Littlejohn, because of all his work with engines, he was one of the most successful engine programmers on ICC, for example. Littlejohn is actually like 2,400 strength, so he's developed quite a bit. And Nakamura says he would be a GM, maybe a weak GM, but he'd be a GM if he could just remember all the opening theory that he's discovered. So Nakamura actually has benefited quite a bit from that partnership. And, you hear about Carlsen working with John Ludwig Hammer, and you hear about, Caruana collaborating with his coaches that are GMs, and you hear about all these partnerships, but Nakamura and Littlejohn actually have a really interesting partnership there. So that, to my knowledge, has continued. That started in like the early 2000s and has continued. And what else? Well, he is engaged. He has a fiancée who's a women's FIDE master from Italy. And in this image, to the top left, you can see them together, and in the bottom right, you can see them walking together with Sunil Weramantry as well. His fiancée lives in Naples, in Italy, and so Nakamura visits her quite often, spends quite a bit of time in Italy. He divides his time pretty much between Italy and St. Louis. He's affiliated with the Chess Club and Scholastic Center of St. Louis, no surprise. But he spends quite a bit of time in Naples, and on his own, in his free time, he enjoys studying language. He considers himself fairly proficient in Italian and a couple of other languages, although Japanese he would consider like his third or fourth language in terms of his level of proficiency. And he's also quite the amateur historian. So even though he did not really enjoy college, Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, he didn't stay there, but for one semester. He still has pursued learning on his own, and in his free time, as I mentioned, also he's quite fond of trading derivatives on stock exchanges and futures markets. So he does have some hobbies, and he's also a supporter of Naples football club and soccer team. So for this lecture, like with Caruana, I relied quite a bit on various news reports, including New York Times profiles, including the Reddit AMA that Hikaru did, which is actually one of the most extensive interviews you can find with him online. Of course, I used chessgames.com. I also used a book that I have over there, Fighting Chess with Hikaru Nakamura. However, Nakamura didn't actually collaborate on that project. There's no text from Nakamura himself. There is an interview that was conducted by another journalist not listed among the authors with Naka when he was playing a tournament in Dortmund in Germany. But Naka didn't have a direct hand in it. The only book he's written or had a direct hand in that I know of is his book on bullet chess, as I've mentioned. So I think I would like to see a more complete volume. Maybe I'm throwing the gauntlet to McFarlane and Company, maybe an Andy Soltis type author to get on that and write a good authoritative biography of Hikaru Nakamura. I think we deserve it. Obviously, there are lots of games with great annotations, but I'd like to see more about his personal life, his thought process, his mentality, although, he's pretty forthcoming about that online. Anyway, as I mentioned next month, we will look at Peter Svidler, and the month after that with Sergei Karyakin. And then we will see who's going to qualify for ratings and move on probably to Palov and I would assume Geary, and then the organizer's choice. And that will take us into the candidates tournament, wherever the heck that's going to occur, in March. So as always, we would welcome any questions or feedback you guys have.
I got one.
Sure.
Has Naka ever commented on why he thinks he has such a bad record against Carlson? It really is quite remarkable that he would, given his record against the other players. Has he ever said anything about why he thinks that's so?
I've not seen any comments to address that directly. Every time I see Naka respond to a question like that, he usually turns it around to try to find the silver lining and say that there are many times where he has played very well against Carlsen. There was that one time where he had a computer valuation of like plus 10 against him, but then made a mistake in kind of a time pressure, and he said it was like a 1 in 100 mistake, and that he was hallucinating. And he talks about how much that loss weighed on him for the next couple of days. But whenever he talks about it, he usually talks about how it can turn around and how he believes that he can turn it around and that he can beat Carlsen and that he's not afraid of him, that he respects his chess prowess, but that he conveys this sense of positivity about his chances against him. So I've never seen him outright comment on how he thinks Carlsen beats him so handily or how he has such a dominant record against him. I usually see him turn the question toward what the potential could be in the future. Yeah. Has he improved in his results against Carlsen? Not in my research.
At least this year he hasn't lost.
Yeah. 2 or 3 games against Carlsen this year, so not a lot. Sinkefeld, Norway. Yeah. So in his recent games, but even that game in the Sinkefeld Cup, Carlsen was, by all commentators' perspectives, better, and by the computer valuation, better as well. And it wasn't so much that Nakamura played very well to salvage a draw, but Carlsen also missed many winning opportunities. And Kasparov and Alejandro Ramirez point those out in the annotations, actually, that there are a lot of times where Carlsen had simpler continuations, which would have been much more forcing. So even in the last game that they played in classical time controls, I don't know that Nakamura showed that he was Carlsen's equal. It just more showed that Carlsen is not playing as strong as chess right now. So if anything, it could be that Naka has a better chance against Carlsen simply because Carlsen slipped, more than that Naka's improved. That said, Naka has probably been thinking much more about his preparation against Carlsen than Carlsen has been thinking about his preparation against Nakamura. So in that sense, Nakamura could have some surprises in store should he be the candidate in the World Championship match. He's known for his opening preparation, and he's known for his indefatigable work with the engine and with Chris Littlejohn, also researching openings and helping him choose which openings to play against which players. And you can bet that his preparation would be very solid in that match. That said, would he be Carlsen's equal in middle and end games? I don't know. I'm not convinced, really. Carlsen showed such a capability of grinding out wins against Anand, for example, in their last 2 series. Anything else? Okay, well, appreciate you guys coming out tonight. Hope you'll join us again October the 21st. That's a week earlier than normal for our lecture on Peter Svidler, who at 39 years old is representing an older generation of chess player faced with all these young whippersnappers. So
Him and Anand.
him and Anand, holding it down. Okay.